Just give me 1 second. Okay, so that's the chapter number 2, which is, I'm starting from chapter number 2, and there's a reason behind it based on my experience. And the chapter 2 is the most simple and the shortest chapter we got in this particular CISSP. This is the easiest, I would say, also based on my experience. So that's why I've chosen this chapter 2 first, and then we'll do 3, 4, 5 in the sequence, and then finally we'll, come up with these others. So this is how they're not related to each other, so it's not going to make difference if we do the in a different order. So chapter 2, it talks about the asset security. Now the question is, what is asset? Now, in general, if you talk about just give me 1 second. Okay. In general, when you talk in the IT environment, asset can refer to many things. They can refer to data, hardware, software, skills, people, programs, your resources. So a lot of things, they come under the asset in an IT environment. And we need to secure these assets because our IT business may depend on that. Because we normally targeting to the IT setups, and these servers, these software, hardware, they may need it for the production environment. So we need to secure them. But as far as this particular chapter is concerned, the asset they are referring to is the data. So in this particular chapter, when I say asset, they normally refer to the data. So this is what we're trying to secure. In this particular chapter, we're addressing the data security, in other words. I know that there are different types of assets in an IT environment, just like I mentioned to you, but here we're referring mostly to the data as an asset. So when it comes to I hope you can see my screen, which says chapter number 2, asset security. So there are different things associated with that. For example, understanding of sensitivity versus criticality. How about, deciding who or maintaining the ownership of the data? Or, for example, some data is only available to certain the people who are responsible for certain tasks, and we'll talk about this. So how do we protect the confidentiality, privacy of this data? Then how do we make sure that the data at rest is properly retained? And then also, how can we have the security restrictions in place, or the access restrictions in place, in other words? So these are the different things we're going to talk about in this chapter, asset security. So there are a few, very general things first we need to understand. For example, we talk about the information system security here. What exactly is it? Now, before we get into this, well, what is the information? Well, information can be, in an IT environment, can be a software, can be some important company record, can be a proprietary information, can be a trade secret, can be a database, can be a software. So there are many examples. You can see intangible items for this particular. So this is the so this, they all come under the information. Now, when we talk about the information system security, we're basically referring to different procedures, processes, which we need to make this information secure. This may involve a CIA triad. And what exactly that means, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That is CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. These are the three things mainly we look at in order to securing our data. Now, what I mean by confidential or confidentiality is the secrecy, privacy. For example, I only want authorized people to look at this information, and the information should not be available to unauthorized people. For example, in different organizations, they have mechanisms based on someone's job responsibility, based on someone's security clearance level. You know, you have different clearance levels at security, especially in the government, as you know. For example, you know, they have secret, top secret, confidential, things like that, different security levels. So depending on how your organization works, so confidentiality is about making it only visible, viewable to the people who have authorization to do so, or who have authority to, who are authorized to view it. Um, if you ask me in a simple, you know, one word, how you can bring the confidentiality? Well, confidentiality is normally provided through the encryption or through the cryptography, and we'll talk about it. The other thing is about the availability. As I said, CIA tried. You know, all the information should have these three things available. Availability means that your information data is always available whenever you want to. I mean, whenever you want to, um, uh, as an authorized person, access it. For example, yahoo.com server. It is supposed to be available for all its customers 24/7. If it is not available and in any particular time, that we consider it is unavailable. So that's the availability factor we are talking about. Or let's say if a particular server, database server, is supposed to be available to you during that particular time frame, that also comes under the availability. How people make it unavailable? You might have heard about people attacking yahoo.com website and, you know, carrying out a DOS attack, denial of service attack, where they actually you know, send a flood of ping packets or the TCP sync requests to that server in order to keep it busy, and that server actually run out of resources because it does not have enough memory processing power, bandwidth available to cater further requests, and this is how the servers get unavailable. What is the loss to the company? Well, the company's reputation, credibility, revenue, they are all lost when the services are not available. So availability is also one of the important aspects. Then comes the integrity. Integrity is about making sure that the data you have sent or the data you are trying to, you're using, is not altered, modified, changed, viewed, or even you know, changed by any unauthorized person. So its integrity is intact. Integrity means you want to make sure this is the genuine data. For example, when you download softwares from a websites, they often give you a hash code, or they give you a message digest MD5 output. Why they give you? Because they want you to calculate this and see if the software you are trying to download or the operating system you're trying to download from a particular website, it's in its original, it's a genuine. There's no changes has been made. You know, someone can inject a malicious content into that. Someone can, you know, uh, add some, let's say, spyware into it, or maybe the file is corrupted. There are some accidental reasons, there are some intentional reasons, there are, you know, different reasons. So integrity is about making sure that the file, data, whatever you're getting is genuine. There's no changes, and all the changes, there's no change has been made by unauthorized users. There's also one thing we commonly refer to, which is called as access control. What is access control? Control means restrictions. So access restrictions. For example, who has what authority to access a particular database or data? For example, in your organization, you may notice not everyone has access to every data. There is always an access restriction. For example, I cannot see HR's payroll records. I cannot see marketing people's budgeting, or the records for the marketing department. So there is an access control in place. Access control is giving people, restricting people, and then deciding who has access to what resources. There are some databases I'm not, I don't have access to use. How do you put these access controls in place? There are different ways. And as we progress, we'll talk about it. For example, mandatory access control, discretionary access control, rule-based access control, role-based access control. So there are different access control mechanisms which you can use in order to use that. So that's the so then coming back, as I said, information, as I said, can be any data, database, software, proprietary information. We need to secure it. And that's why we talk about the information system security. And how, when we talk about the information system security, we have three things, as I said, comes in mind: CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability. And then we also talked about the access control, restricting people who do not have access to these resources. Then, because we just started this chapter, so we're talking about the basic definitions. Comes into an asset. What do you mean? What do we mean by asset in an IT environment? As I said before, an asset can be hardware, software, database, data, any device, employee. They all come under the asset. And here we referring to data mostly, as I said in chapter number 2, but in general, these are all assets in an IT environment. And basically, we want to learn about dealing with the risk factor in an IT environment. And so that's why we going through that. And let me tell you, there's one thing we commonly talk about, which is threat. What is exactly a threat? Threat is, let's say, when any of the vulnerability you have can be exploited. Well, it may be exploited in an accidental means, or maybe intentional, malicious intent. Someone wants to modify your data who's not authorized to. Someone wants to inject, having a threat of getting malware. So when you are on the internet, you are under threat. And why do I say this? Because internet is the most unsecure network in the world. We don't even know who uses this, because there are hundreds and thousands of networks there. This is a common network catering a huge, all over the world. So we don't even know who are the people. This is the most insecure network in the world, internet. And if you talk about the media, the wireless is the most insecure media in the world. And then we'll talk about it, because wireless will deal with in the media. But coming back to here, so when you are on internet, you are under threat. For example, threat of being hacked, threat of being, getting malware, threat of your data can be leaked. There are different threats. So threat is basically, um, when your vulnerabilities get exploited. And then the next question is, what is a vulnerability? Vulnerability is a flaw or a gap or weakness in your system, in your network, in your software, in your hardware. Could be anything. Let me give you an example of vulnerability. You did not install latest patches on your operating system, which are suggested by Microsoft. Let's say you're using a Windows operating system. That's vulnerability because you have a weakness which can be exploited. They often come with the Microsoft hot fixes, patches, and they want you to install it, immediately because they want you to be secure. As soon as they figure out any weakness, vulnerability, they suggest you to, have this. They always come up with a solution. So that's the. What is the other vulnerability I can think of? Let's say you don't have an antivirus installed in your computer. So that's the weakness or flaw you have in the security. You could be under threat of getting malware, getting infected by spyware, getting infected by viruses, getting infected by Trojans. That's the weakness. And then also we'll talk about the other vulnerabilities. Then comes the risk. And risk is basically the potential for loss, damage, destruction of an asset. And how it's going to happen when a threat is going to exploit a vulnerability. For example, in some cases, it's not really intentional. You could also be under risk because of non-intentional reasons. Let's say natural disasters. There's a flooding. There is let's say, bad weather, earthquake. So these are also, you are under at risk. That's also true. So risk can be intentional, can be can be accidental, can be intentional, but then we need to understand the risk. And because why are we talking about these things? Because we're talking about the data security or the asset security, and we need to understand all the possibilities, probabilities, or the potential for in some areas maybe the weather is always a troubling, so you may be under constant threat, or you have a very high risk. Can you have a zero risk? Well, technically, we say no. You always have a risk, but if you can have it manageable within an acceptable limit, this is what we want. So if you're looking at the risk definition, well, there are a couple of definitions they have mentioned in the book. The first definition they have mentioned is risk is equals to threat times vulnerability. So risk basically depends on two things: threat as well as the vulnerability. In another definition, they have mentioned risk is equals to threat plus vulnerability plus asset. So they say basically risk is the intersection of these three things: threat, vulnerability, asset. Now I'm more inclined to this definition, which you see on my screen. Risk is equals to threat times vulnerability. So let's take an example. Let's say I have a computer which is connected to internet, and I do not have the antivirus installed in this computer. So I have vulnerability because I don't have the antivirus installed. I'm vulnerable to malware attacks, and I'm connected to the internet. So that means, as I said, internet is the most insecure network. So I am under constant threat of getting a malware, getting a spyware, getting a virus, getting any, these malicious contents or softwares. So the risk level is very high. So how can I reduce the risk? Either I work on one thing or I work on the other thing, either on threat or the vulnerability, or I work on both of these in order to reduce it. So for example, if I disconnect it from the internet, I still don't have the antivirus installed, but now the risk level is low because I'm not connected to the internet. So the threat value is lower, and even though I have a vulnerability, but I'm still not at as much risk as I were before. Or other thing you do, you install an antivirus. Now in this case, you um, came over to your shortcoming, which is the vulnerability. So it's you manage to reduce the risk. Now what if you work on both? You have the antivirus installed as well as you disconnect from the internet. Well, I know it's not really possible in all situations, but let's, for the sake of the understanding, if you can do both, you have a minimal risk. You have a minimal risk. So the lower the risk you have, the better it is. Because these threats, they result in attacks. If you have a very high threat, that means you have a very, you could be attacked. So that's why we want to work on these two things. So coming back to this, as I said, we want to protect our asset, as I said, different assets. Let's take data. That's what we considering more in this chapter. So as I said, we know threat is basically any object, people who can pose a threat to our asset. And so basically this is the threat, and then we talked about the vulnerability, and now we know that the risk is basically product of threat times vulnerability, and we want to reduce the risk as much as possible. So that's but then there are some risks which are unavoidable, and then that we also understand. Then comes the roles and the responsibilities. We know in organizations you normally see the C-level executives, they have these different, and this has been in a very long time, but now you commonly see also a C-level executives in information security in organizations. It was not a common practice. If you look at 15-20 years back, it was not very common. Now it is very common, having a chief information security officer or an information security officer in an organizations, because now we feel that it is very important to have someone also at the top management who understands these security related aspects. It's very important. It's very, very important. So what I'm trying to say here is that information security officer, you're going to see most of the time, they analyze these risks. They find ways to mitigate. By the way, how do you deal with a risk? Is there any, for example, some people say, can you avoid it? Can you, so what are the different strategies dealing with a risk? Anyone wants to share something in this?
Sometimes in what we've had to do is put controls in place for that risk. And as you said, depends on what the risk is. Sometimes you can patch it, and then sometimes you have to put other controls in place that either go around that risk completely, or if you could just uninstall it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So there are different ways you can do it. For example, the mention you mentioned, in some cases you want to mitigate it. In some cases you want to avoid it. But in general, we say, you can avoid the risk, you can mitigate the risk, you can transfer the risk, you can reject a risk, you can accept a risk. There are different ways you deal with it. By saying that transferring the risk, I mean, let's say you got an insurance company involved, and so you basically put the burden on their shoulders, and in some cases mitigate, let's say, having a controls in place as you suggested. In this way you can mitigate it, or you uninstall it. That means you totally want to avoid it. Reject the risk also in some cases is possible. And then in some cases you want to accept it. uh, accept it means, yeah, go ahead.
I would also say the asset also determines on how we want to control the risk. If the asset's cost is very low, it may not even be affordable or worthwhile to put any kind of controls in place.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we definitely don't want to invest more in avoiding risk, which is even higher the cost of the actual asset. Absolutely, absolutely. You're right. So, when we take these different strategies in mind, we need also to, see what is the worth of the asset. Is it really that valuable? Is it really that worth of investing that much or taking care of that much? So yes, we need to identify asset worth also, and then based on this we decide, yeah, the our strategy, how we want to deal with it. Yeah, thank you very much, excellent. Yeah, so as I said, in some cases we want to accept it. For example, if you can't do anything and you know that the flood is going to come, and you are located in a, in a geographical area where the floods are there's nothing much you can do, so you have to accept it. Means add the cost of this damage into your expenses. You want to accept it. So that's also, but that's may not be a right strategy, but then in some cases you may not have a much choice about it. So this is the information security officers, or the chief information security officer's job, is to take all these evaluations and make a decision, and decide how he's or she's gonna deal with it. These days we also see steering committees. They define risks, they define different approaches to deal with it, and the objectives they have in. You also see auditors, who time to time evaluate, audit, see what has been the practices are, or, what has been done. Then comes the data owner, and it says data owner is the one who classifies the data. Now that's only true in that's not true in all cases, because there are different types of access control mechanisms. Generally, if we when we use our operating systems in computers, it works on the basis of discretionary access control. So normally the person who is the owner of a file or a data or a folder or a software, he or she decides who should who can access it. Um, that person decides, the owner decides, but that's not in the mandatory access control. This is not how the government organization work, and they have their different mechanisms in place. For example, they use a mandatory access control. So, but in general, a perception is that whoever is the owner of the data, he or she is the best person to suggest who can have access to this data. That person classifies data. Then you also hear one more term is the data custodian. Data custodian is about the person who manages or who deals or the maintains this uh, data on the day-to-day basis. For example, giving authorities, giving rights, depending on someone's job responsibilities, that can be considered as a data custodian. Network administrator, as we all know, he runs the day-to-day, networking, operations, and make sure that the uh, resources are available whenever they want to. Then comes the security administrator. And that person, as the name suggests, deals with all types of security related tasks. Um, it makes sure that it's confidential. It makes sure that its integrity is intact. It makes sure that it is available. And so that's the security administrator's job. Is nowadays, you may have also heard, seen in your organization, you also have an incident response team. It was not a common practice to have the incident response team about 10-15 years back, but now all the organizations, they may, if they don't have the dedicated team of incident response team, sometimes they also have kind of they assign additional responsibilities to the networking professionals to have this incident response team, because incidents are more common and you need to have people dedicated to that who can go through a systematic procedure. So that we'll also discuss. Then comes the data classification. Is every data is really the same value as in your organization? No, not all data is created equal. Some data has more worth than the other. Some data has more value than the other. So your strategy for security should also consider this factor, because as just mentioned, that we don't want to spend more money on data which need not to be secured, which may not be really that important. So we don't want to waste our resources behind that data. So data classification is very important. And how do you classify the data? Well, this is, for example, do you want to have the labels? This is what in the government organizations they do. They label the data. It's a top secret, it's a secret, it's a confidential, or whatever it is. They label the data because they work on the basis of mandatory access control. But and then I'll talk about what I mean by sensitivity. So you need to understand how sensitive your data is. Is it really that sensitive you need to hide, or is it so? That's very important also. So, and then it also uses a term here, configuring baseline security. What is the baseline security? Baseline security is the security, kind of you can say minimum security you should have in a system, in a computer. um, for securing that, you can have additional things, but there's always a baseline and you want to make it as a benchmark. So you say my baseline is this. For example, I want um, it to have, let's say, a secure kernel, secure operating system, firewall. Let's say processes are isolated. These are the things I'm looking at. So you need to decide your baseline security, and that's the minimum security you want to expect from your systems, network, or the computers. um, and then there's a term we use, cost. And cost means value of the data. Some data is very valuable, some data may not be. For example, if it is your trade secret, that's very important. If it is your proprietary information, that your business rely on that, that's very, very valuable. um, so you need to have a way of classifying your data. How do you classify it? What is the criteria you want to use for classification of data? How do you decide which one has more worth than this? And then you also use the term controls. As I said, controls means restrictions. And so you want to make sure that you have the minimum security requirements in place for a computer, for a particular this. Then comes the data owner. As I said, data owner is the person who normally decides or classifies data, who suggests who should be able to access it, who should not be able to, who should not be authorized to use it. And then data custodian, who implements this, who maintains this data, make sure that it is according to the policies. And the data processors are you and me, who use this data every day. It could be some software, it could be any database, it could be any data which we use. So we are the data processors, we are the users. Um, so and then we will talk about it later on about, let's say, um, PII. And I think we all know PII is the personally identifiable information. PII is the employees' records, employees' personal information. For example, your social security number. In Canada, we call it social insurance number. Your let's say, date of birth, your personal information. It is the responsibility of the employer to protect the personal information of employees. By law, it's the responsibility, it's the legally requirement from the employer to protect this. So in that case, that's an example. PII, the employer should take it very seriously to protect it. So then comes to the, how do you decide an asset's value? Just like we talked about before, what is the criteria? What are the points? How you decide? Maybe how much this values to your organization. For example, this formula which you use to make your soft drink, that's the main, that's very important for you to protect because your business relies on that. Your business is totally dependent on that. So that's very important. So, very valuable to your organization. What happens? You should ask these questions from someone. What happens if you lose it or if it is get compromised? Do you think, are you going to be affected by that? Do you have any legal obligation to protect it? For example, we talked about PII. What if employer mistakenly or deliberately um, leak that information of the employees? Well, they are legally responsible for that. They have to, so yes, there are legal factors. Liabilities, yes. Are you gonna be liable if, let's say, if you lose that data? And is this data, do you think your competitors are going to get a value from it? Is it really important for your competitors? Maybe your client names, maybe your customers database, maybe your business secrets, maybe your marketing strategies, maybe your future strategy for your products. These are all, I think, very valuable to your competitors. They always look for it. What about the costs associated with this? So there are different things you can ask yourself, and then based on this, it will tell you how important, how valuable that data, that asset is for you. Then comes a very simple concept of, in the book they mention it. What's the difference between sensitivity and criticality? Um, in terms of when we were talking about the data, is it necessary that if the data is sensitive, it's also critical? Or is it necessary that the data is critical can also be sensitive? No. Well, so what's the difference between a sensitive and the critical? Sensitivity means how freely you want it to be, let's say, handled. For example, it's about the employee's payroll. It's sensitive. We don't want everyone to see it. We only want the authorized people to see it. That's sensitive. Um, what about the critical? Critical example is, let's say, your a software you need to run your production. Without that software, you're not able to run your production. So is that sensitive? May not be, but it's definitely critical to your business, because without this, you are unable to run your production. So that's the main difference between a sensitivity and criticality. Sensitivity is about, how freely that data you want to be handled, and then criticality, how important that data is for your day-to-day business. So then you need to decide. So this is how the difference is. So the question you should be asking, would it be possible for you to recover that data? Let's say if you lose it, or if there is any disaster. What is a disaster? Disaster can be power outage. Disaster can be, your server is stolen, your hard drive is stolen, data is leaked, data has been modified, malware attack, data has been compromised, um, physical damage to your assets. The different types of disasters could be a natural disaster, could be a intentional man-made disaster, could be a former disgruntled employees, actions. So disaster can be of different types. So you should be asking, would it be possible to recover that data? And how long can you survive without that data? And how easy it is for you to recover that data? And if you lose that data, how long you will be out of business? Let's say in some cases, this, that can stop your production. And we know that every organization has a defined timelines. Um, if they cannot able to continue their business within that defined timeline, they may not survive. So that also comes under the business continuity. So if you want to, classify, the sensitivity can be divided into two, the restricted and unrestricted. Restricted is, of course, the sensitive. Unrestricted, there's no issue. There's no sensitivity issue with this. And then criticality, you define, categorize in three, steps. For example, essential, which you need to have always in hand. You cannot survive without it, even for a very, very short period of time. Required, if you can survive for some, shorter periods of time, that's the required data. And the last one is deferable data, if you are able to survive without this data for a longer periods of time. So this is how they categorize criticality. So these are how do they decide sensitivity and the criticality. So now they tell you the examples of unrestricted data, the data which you don't really think it's something maybe employees schedule, there's maybe no point having secrecy in it. And just like in a university environment, having a schedule of classes, that's not really a sensitive. But then when you come to the critical, as I said, if you're using something essential data, you cannot live without it even for a second. But then as you go to the other records, then they give you some time you can survive without it. So this is how you distinguish between these. So then comes to the sensitivity classification types. And as I said, generally there are 4 types of access controls. We call it mandatory access control, discretionary access control, rule-based access control, and role-based access control. In government organizations and in most of the the organization where the security is a concern, they use mandatory access control. So mandatory access control means that you need to have certain, go through certain background checks, and you need to have a certain, based on your security clearance, they classify you that you have this type of security clearance. And based on this, you are only capable or you are only eligible to only view or you know deal with the data or the assets which fall in that category or in that particular the security clearance type or the lower level. You cannot access the higher level. So mostly in kind of a government organizations, in organizations where security is a prime request, prime concern, you want to use a mandatory access control. And so basically in these organizations, every data, every file, every folder, every asset, every server, every hardware, every software, they all are classified, they all have labels, and you can only access those if you have the similar um, the security clearance. If you do not, you cannot access those. That's we call it mandatory access controls. But in general, um, in commercial organizations, it depends if they think it's really they need to. But generally, you're going to see discretionary access control, and discretionary access control, as the name suggests, it sets the discretion of the person who's in charge. So if I have a policy and I said, if you are a project manager, you should have access to this and this data. If you are in HR, you should have access to this and this data. So basically, it's at my discretion. Or in the operating system which we use, except two operating systems which are used by the government organizations, all operating systems, they are based on discretionary access control. So it's basically you are the creator of the data. You assign the authorities. It's at your discretion how you want to give access to certain groups, users. How you want to decide. But then there are two um, operating systems, and they both are Linux. One is the Reddit based, and the other one, I guess, is the CentOS. They do offer a mandatory access control based operating system, but these are not the ones we commonly use. These are mostly used by the government organization or the organization who really think that the sensitivity should be based on the classification of the based on the security clearance. So mandatory access control. So in that case, they use these particular operating system. But generally, with all the operating system we use, they're based on discretionary access control. So in government organization or where there's privacy, you're gonna see different levels of security clearance level, and then depending on the person, employee, whatever they got, they can only access that level or lower that level in some cases, but not the higher level. So they basically label it, and these labels distinguish it. Okay. So, it says the data may require higher level of integrity and availability, but not confidentiality. So, the higher the integrity you have, and then we'll discuss in the model. So in some cases, for example, the prices at the Walmart, um, they should be available all the time to the customers, to the authorized people, but they are not confidential at the same time. So in some cases, you may need availability, but you don't need confidentiality. So you want customers to see the price of each item you're selling in the Walmart, but yeah, definitely you want the availability. You don't want, and you also want the integrity, because you don't want anyone to change or modify the prices. So which thing you're looking for, it also depends on the application. So there are three types of data. Um, Data at rest, data in use, and data in transit. I think the most challenging one is the data in transit, but then there are three states of data. The data at rest is something you're not using it. For example, the data is in my hard drive, which I'm not using right now. That is data at rest. The data is in my computer, which I'm not using right now, which is turned off, or which may be not accessing that particular data. That is called data at rest. and that requires the different type of security than the others. For example, in this case, you are more concerned about the physical security. Then comes the data in use. For example, right now I have opened a PowerPoint slide. So that particular data is in use. This is my PowerPoint file. So that data is in use. So that's an example of data in use. And then data in transit. For example, you're sending an email, that data is in transit. You accessing a web page from Microsoft.com, Yahoo.com. So these contents of these web pages, they also example of data in motion or in transit. So it's very simple to distinguish between these three states. Let me just quickly say data at rest means the data which is not in use. The data in use, which means right now I'm open the PowerPoint file, so that's in my use. The data in transit means the web pages I'm downloading or the emails I have sent, they're still in transit, they're still in motion. So that's the data in transit. I think the most of the challenge we have is the data in transit, and most frequently we use IPsec, IP security. We use SSL, secure socket layer, or the TLS, transport layer security. And we're going to talk about it in chapter number 3 about what is SSL, or the new version of SSL is the TLS, transport layer security. That's very useful. You might have heard about HTTPS, FTPS. You see S in the end. That S indicates that this particular protocol is SSL based. So this means secure, and it's secure because it's based on SSL. So that's the reason normally we want to choose a protocol which is HTTPS rather than HTTP, because HTTP does not use SSL. So data in transit, we commonly use SSL, secure socket layer. I will explain you what I mean by that. How do we use it? But right now, just to make it just clear that SSL based is a securing one of the method for the data in transit. Then comes the system hardening and baselining. What is the system hardening do we mean? And what is the baselining do we mean? System hardening means we want to reduce the attack surface. What is the attack surface? When an attacker or when a hacker, to be very honest, hacker was not a negative term. About 10-15 years back, the hacker was one of the software development team who used to find the bugs in the software. And they used to call him hacker. But then later on, it went totally negative term. And now if you ask anyone, they always think of it as a negative term. Someone who wants to have a bad intention, who wants to exploit your system, who wants to compromise your system, who wants to steal something, who wants to damage to your system. This is what that comes into the hacker. But generally, as I said before, hacker was not really a negative term. It was used in software anyway. So what does it mean by system hardening? System hardening means you want to reduce your attack surface. What is attack surface? That's the military term. And in military, you want to reduce your asset, the surface, which could be or in other words, let's say, minimize the the possibility of getting attacked. So you want to reduce that surface, because the larger the surface is, the more likely you can uh, get hit, the more likely you can can be attacked. So you want to reduce the attack surface. How can you reduce the attack surface in a IT environment? Well, don't run unnecessary services over a database server, for example, or a web server, for example, or an email server, for example, or a telnet server, or a FTP server. Why do I say this? Let's say you're running a web server, okay? And it, at the same time, I think in the ideal practice is don't run any other service on this. Just have a dedicated server for one application. Because if you run other applications or services on that server, then you know what's going to happen. It will, all the services, they are associated with a port. And when I say port, I don't mean the physical port, which is in the switch or the router. I mean the virtual port. So every service you run in a system, in a network, in a system, it's gonna open up its corresponding virtual port. And these virtual ports are the source of entry for the attackers, for the intruders, for the people who have negative intentions, for the people who wants to see, get familiar with your system. Because normally the hackers, they don't just attack it. They do a lot of homework. They do a lot of, go through a lot of, if they are smart, they go through a lot of background work before they really do it. If it is someone who's newbie, they just attack it, and that's not the effective way. Anyway, so coming back to this hardening, how do you harden it? Well, reduce the attack surface. How can you reduce the attack surface? Let's say do not run the services other than the main service which you intend for if you are on internet. So if you're maintaining a web server, just run the website, just run the web services. Don't run any other services on that particular server, because other services are gonna open the virtual ports, and these the more virtual ports you have available in your system, the easier it is for an attacker or intruder to get into your system. So you want to keep these, just like the doors in your home. You just don't want to have the unnecessary doors in your home. You just want to have the, the only the doors you really need it, for your convenience. So unless if you have the without any reason lots of doors, then you also have to worry about the security, because you are actually providing the more attack surface, the more opportunities to the attacker to get an entry, or to the intruder to get into your house. So the same is the case here. We don't want unnecessary services. Just have only the service. Or if it is an email service, just run an email service. If you're FTP service, just run the FTP. If it is a telnet service, just run the telnet. Don't run unnecessary other things, because that will make you vulnerable to intruders, to attackers. And then make sure you always have the updated software. If you're running, let's say operating system, you should always have updated operating system patches, packs, whatever the vendor suggests. If you're running a particular vendor software, make sure you apply all the necessary required patches which vendor has suggested you, because you want to keep yourself always up to date in terms of security. You don't want to be vulnerable. You don't want to give an opportunity to an attacker to exploit any vulnerability and get into your system, because you want to reduce your attack surface. Why you want to reduce your attack surface? Because you want to harden your system. So it's pretty simple. We don't like the default accounts. Why we don't like the default accounts? Because anyone can guess what's the password be like, what's the username be like. So we don't like the default accounts. When attackers get into, let's say somehow they got into your system, they got into your web server, they got into your network. Now in the second step, they always look for the default accounts. And because the default accounts have always the same defined credentials, so they're very happy to have a default account, and through the default account they get the higher privilege account and they get more access to other resources. So that's why we're saying that do not offer the default accounts, and also do not have the default settings, because this is something predictable and we don't want to give any convenience to the attacker or the intruder to exploit it. So we don't like the default settings, we don't like the default accounts when it comes to protecting our system. And making sure you have the auditing in place. What is auditing? How do you do the auditing? They say enabling security configurations. What is security configurations? Well, let's say auditing. Now, what is auditing? Auditing means looking into the log file. Um, who logged in? What time? How long? What did they do? What were they, all these things. If you are a good network administrator, you should always look into the log files, even if there's no trouble, even if there's no indication of an attack. It should be your regular practice to keep an eye on log files, syslog files, or whatever, depending on which operating system you use. But always, now why do I say this? Well, first of all, a lot of network administrators, they give me excuse that um, it's too much to look into it, and so we don't get time. Well, there are certain tools you can use, and you can filter out the from the log file. I know log file is huge because hundreds of, depending on your organization, hundreds of people logging in, logging out, accessing resources, doing a lot of things, and you just find it overwhelming to go through this information. But um, having said that, if you use a certain tools, you can filter down, and it's very important for you to look into these log information. Why you want to look it? Because that can give you an indication, or that can provide you an information if there is a about a future possible attack. Sometimes we find suspicious logs. Sometimes we find why this employee is trying to access this database server 3 times, 2 times, when he or she is not allowed to access this database. So why he has been trying or she has been trying, you know, or let's say, why, who is this person from outside our network who frequently visiting our network, and he's not apparently one of our client IP or one of our user IP. Who's that person? What he does? Well, someone may be doing a research, or someone is doing a homework or background collecting information about your network before they carry it. As I said, the smart hackers, they don't do it overnight. They do a lot of homework before they really carry out an attack. So before that, if you have a habit of looking into the log files, you can figure out a lot of potential problems which are going to happen in the future. So auditing is very important. Firewall, of course, is very important. It's one of the security devices we always use in your network. I'm sure in the DMZ, you must have the server surrounded by 2 back-to-back firewalls. We also use software-based firewalls in our home computers. Even as a user, individual user, if you are concerned about your security, you can download a software-based firewall, which may not be as effective as a hardware-based firewall, but it's still, that can protect you. So remind you, firewall is a network security appliance where you can set the rules. For example, you want to say what you want to have, what you don't want to have, most of these firewalls, they work on the basis of the what they call it as a whitelisting or the implicit deny policy. By default, everything is denied until you write a permission for that. So that's the firewall. So it's also one of the updates. As I said, it's always a good idea to have latest updates about the software, about the email, whichever you're using, use the updated one. And of course, the physical security, don't forget about it. Why? No matter how good encryption you have, no matter how good security control mechanisms you have in place, if you don't have the physical security, and in other words, if anyone can get into your facility, if any stranger, outsider can get an entry into your data center, then there's no point of having these encryption and all these things, because so the physical security is the number one aspect, and then you worry about other thing. If you don't have the physical security in place, well, I think the other things may not be really that much important. So make sure the physical security is in place. Yeah. Baselining, as I said, the minimum set of um, the the security you can have. So you can make a benchmark and you say, in our system we want to have these things, so that this is the minimum baseline in our company's servers, in our company's computers. That's the benchmark. This is the minimum security, at least security you want in a system. You can have more than that, but the baseline is the your minimum expectations. So you set it up. That's the baseline. Then comes the configuration management. Configuration management is about knowing all the details about your system, about your network, about your, for example, what operating system you're using, what type of processor you're using, how much RAM do you have, how much, let's say, what are the specs of this computer, what bandwidth do you have. These are the things you need in a configuration management. Identifying, documenting hardware, software, and other settings on your computer. Why you want to do this? Because if you, let's say, have to reproduce a similar system, if you have the records of the all the configuration, um, you can reproduce a system like that. Um, so it's very important. For example, in disaster recovery, you need to have this configuration management is important, because if your server is damaged, if your server is not working, let's say due to any reason, power outage, or maybe flooding, anything, you need to continue your business. So can you reproduce a similar system and get your production going? Well, that's why you need a configuration management. Configuration management is about knowing each and every spec of your system, of your server, so that you can reproduce it. So these are all the things you need to understand. So what are the informations you should document about the configuration management? What are the information you should note down? Well, these are the obvious, for example, we use HP server and we have 8 GB RAM. We use 2.4 gigahertz server. We use Windows 10 operating system, for example, and we have this BIOS version. We have these, settings. Why we need to know about the IP addresses or MAC addresses? Because sometimes some softwares don't work. They need to have the same, logical or physical addresses so that they can work. So, that's why it's also important. And then organization label, so that you know where they belong to. Then comes the change management. Change management is, as the name says, is how do you handle a change in a IT production environment? How do you handle a change? So let's say you are a database company, and your vendor told you, just inform you that you need to upgrade your operating system from Windows 8.1 to Windows 10. They said because the recent changes into their database operating system won't allow it to run over Windows 8.1 because they have just modified their database software. And they said with the new changes in effect, it's not possible to use Windows 8.1 anymore. So you need to upgrade your operating system from Windows 8.1 to Windows 10, let's say. Or let's say your database, let's say, okay, so your web server provider said, listen, you need to change your computer servers from 32-bit to 64-bit because of a new software, their updated patches, or the additional software code they have added. They said it's not going to work on Windows 32-bit machines. You need a 64-bit machine. That's also example of change. Change can be hardware, can be software, can be anything. So the question is, can you just change it right away if they suggest you? Or do you think you need to go through a process and then make a change? So any advice? Mhm. Anyone would like to say something? Do you think in a production IT environment, can you just change it right away, or you need to go through a certain process?
What what we currently do is first the request is made usually through an IT ticket on what you're looking to do. Example, Windows 7 Pro to Windows 10. Then after that, it gets approved usually by management that this is done. And then before we put it into a production, we have a test production. And then once that's tested out and we would deem it worthy, we'd roll it into actual production because then we would know there's no bugs or issues.
Excellent, excellent. And this is what the right step is. This is what the right strategy is, because this is how the changes should be done. The moment you realize you need to make a change, you cannot just change it right away. You have to go through a certain procedure. And, we also teach this thing in ITIL, Information Technology Infrastructure Library. There is a change management process. Why we do not want it to um, just change right away, because that change may not result in the way we expected. So we want to make sure that the change is as per our expectation, because this is a production environment. We don't want to take chances. We don't want to discontinue our business. So we want to make sure that our changes are not going to create a disaster, not going to create any issue and discontinue our production. So in order to do this, let's say whenever someone, let's say your vendor told you to upgrade your hardware, well, you make a proposal. And you make a proposal, let's say, well, there are some changes for which you don't need a proposal, but then, depending on what type of change is it, sometimes they call it as a is it a minor change or major change, but generally you create a proposal, and in proposal you write down why you want to do this, what you want to do this, and what will be the advantage, and the negative things you can expect from this. So you write a proposal and you submit it to the management, and generally the management, they um, set up a change advisory board, we call it CAB. Change advisory board is the committee where they ask people from different departments, for example, from the network administrators, software development team, database, depending on what type of change is it. And they ask people to attend this meeting, be part of this change advisory board, CAB. And in that change advisory board, they sit together, they walk through all the changes which you have requested or anyone has requested. They discuss, they can think of all the issues, and based on their discussion, based on their understanding, they come up with a decision whether they want to approve it or reject it. Let's say if they have approved it, then it's not all. Now you have to test it before you actually bring it into the production. So how do you test it? Well, you normally we do it in a virtualized environment. We know you can create virtual machines, and if something goes wrong with the virtual machine, there's no liability. You can just delete the virtual machine. It's not going to impact your system. So generally test it in a virtualized environment. So let's say if you have to, upgrade from Windows 7 to Windows 10, maybe you install that operating system and run that database service and see how it responds. So once you satisfied with the output from that virtualized testing, but still you have to think about one possibility, and that's you need to have a plan B. What happens if this doesn't work? What is the plan B do you have? um, because some changes are irreversible. So you make a change, you won't be able to get back to your previous state, because as I said, some changes are irreversible. So that's why it's important also to have a plan B. And then once you have all these things and you're satisfied with the testing, then you can go on with the changes, and this is how you can implement it. So this is a change management process which needs to be done in that way, so that to make sure that our changes go smoothly and it does not create any impact on a negative impact, and we should always have a plan B. Yeah. So as I said, these are the steps. You submit your proposal, and then these people in the change advisory board, sometimes you don't really name it as a change advisory board, but in some organizations you just create a team and they just have a meeting and they discuss. But if you want to make it very formal, then you name it as a change advisory board. Okay, so you say, okay, so um, you know um, um, uh, they're going to look at, walk over, see the risks, see the issues associated with this, and they're going to decide what to do with it. And then goes through the implementation testing, and whatever you do, make sure you document it, so that if others also know what you're trying to do. Then comes the patch management. What's the difference between a patch management and a change management? Well, we say patch management is a sub process of change management. So change management is kind of a bigger change. Patch management, we consider it as a sub process, or maybe kind of a, there's still a change, but it may not be a significant change. So let's say your vendor asks you to install this patch on the software you're using. So that is the you're not gonna, well, it's a patch, but it's still, so maybe you want to test it in a virtualized environment. So as I said, patch management is still a change management, but it may not be as significant as a change management, but you can still see. Sometimes also you need to do through the pen testing. Um, does anyone of you know why do we need this pen testing? Can you think of why? What is pen testing? Yeah.
The penetration that we usually do is first we'll do some kind of compliance. We'll put a stick in place. Sorry, one second. Let me shut this door. Um, we put a stick in place, which would be our baseline, and then we'll pen test to see if there's any vulnerabilities that show up with it. If there are, then we try to patch those or mitigate those.
Excellent. Yeah, yeah. Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, so pen testing is kind of a simulated, we would say, attack we can think of. And normally we either we hire a third-party consultant or we ask someone from our organization to do this pen testing. And what this person is going to do is to use different tools to try to penetrate as much as possible in our network, in our system, in our resources, in our assets, and see if he or she can find the vulnerabilities. In most of the cases, they identify the vulnerabilities. For example, the patch is missing, or and it's possible to exploit a particular vulnerability. So pen testing, as I said, and it's a very if you look back again 5 years back, you may not see much about the pen testers and these things. Nowadays it's a very lucrative, it's very common profession. A lot of people who do freelancing work, they do the contracting, they use these pen um, they're good at using these pen testing tools, and so they get hired by these companies and they conduct these simulated attacks and they generate a report, yeah, and they notify their organizations that what are the security loopholes or the vulnerabilities they did found, they did find in the network. So, and then in some cases the organizations, they hire full time, or in some cases they ask someone to take an additional responsibility in the organization. So if you want to be a pen tester, there are a few exams or there are few tools you need to get familiar. And I think Certified Ethical Hacker also covers part of some of the tools which are needed in pen test. Well, one thing we need to make sure, sometimes pen testers can also end up damaging assets. That's, of course, it's accidental. It's not intentional, but yes, it's possible that sometimes pen tester unintentionally, maybe because of less experience, maybe because of some um, eh, and sometimes even it's not because of experience, they do damage your system, so just be careful. Yeah. So there are different organizations, the websites you can go on, and you can find out the latest patches available for different softwares, operating systems, and you can see a list of this and you can figure out, and they can identify, they can tell you about the vulnerabilities and their available patches. So these are the websites do you see here by the government and by the other organization. If you want to need a reference for known vulnerabilities, you should go to their websites. They can give you a list of these and you can find out. Yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna go with the data quality, but how about if we take a quick break? So let's say, how about if we take a 10, 12 minutes break? But before that, let me tell you one thing. I'm recording these sessions. So if in case you are interested in recording, just feel free to ask me and I will share these recordings with you. So, you want to listen me again or go to any particular point, just it's possible. I'm recording all these sessions, so they will be available to you. I can send it to you through the WeTransfer, and it's pretty easy to have the recording. So just let me know if you're interested. And the second thing, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's Brian. I'd be interested in getting the recordings. So.
Absolutely, sir. I will make sure to share it with you. I will actually, gonna retransfer to all of you, and whoever is interested can download it. So yeah, it's definitely. I'll make sure that I will provide you, and also the Google Drive folder. I'm supposed to share with you link. Then I'm just let me, if you can give me 1 second, I can share it right now with you. So. All right, so I'm back and let's start. Before break, we discussed many things, and that includes the change management and the patch management. The next, we're going to talk about the data quality and why do we need to know about the data quality is because we want to know if if it's able to serve its purpose. And so, is it accurate enough? Is it fit enough? Is it complete? Is it relevant? Is it accessible? So all these things, they come under the data quality. And there is a term which we use, data verification and the data validation. What is the difference between data verification and the data validation is data verification is about, making sure that you are typing what is needed. For example, you typing your username, you typing your password. So you want to verify, is it the exact same password or the username you have typed in? That's the data verification. It's really the data you wanted to be there. Data validation comes from the, you might have heard about the input validation. Input validation is a term we use for the databases. And, there are many threats to database just because of this not having an input validation. Now, what is an input validation? Um, what happens that in databases, people make queries. And through these queries, they retrieve data out of, they, for example, I want to see the list of the, users and things like this. So we make a query and we get the output from the database. But when the data, the input validation is not in place, let's say the special characters are not allowed, and so we use these different special characters or the characters which database is unable to understand. So in some cases these database crashes, and they, by crashing, they provide us a lot of leakage information and the, unnecessary information. So basically, the database does not know how to handle these inputs. For example, I send a special character percent or ampersand or things like this, and database does not know what to do with it. So in order to, in process of interpreting this query, they, if there is a, the often databases, they end up crashing or they end up, leaking information. So this is called, we call it the attacks which are due to input, not having an input validation. You might have seen in ATM machines. In ATM machines, where you withdraw money, for example, you use your debit card and you want to withdraw money from the ATM machine, or the ATM card. You might have seen there's only numbers in there. There's no alphabet in there because the bank doesn't want you to send any input which is not required, because you all supposed to enter is the 4 digits of the your PIN number through the ATM key the what they have the keyboard, and they only have the numbers, and so you can only type in numbers. They don't want you to type in anything else which can impact, which can make their database kind of a confused or not able to interpret your input query. So coming back to here, data validation is very important. Data validation is about making sure that the data is according to what is expected of. So for example, my requirement for the password is it should be all small letters. This is what I want to validate. I don't want anyone to type in anything else. Let's say in some cases I want my password to be one block letter, one number, some small letters, total 8 characters. We can fix it. You might have seen this. I mean, in many websites they ask you to specifically exactly input the way they want. This is called data validation because they only want you to do the way they asking you. So so what's the difference between data verification? Data verification is just what you want to enter, just making sure you want to enter ABCD, that's just according to this. But data validation is about what is the format, what is the acceptable inputs. You have to keep that in mind also. Then there's another term which comes quality assurance versus quality control. What's the difference between these two? Quality assurance is more towards process oriented, and quality control is has to do with the product, product oriented. Quality assurance is proactive. Quality control is reactive. So in quality assurance, let's say you want to have these things, but then the end of the day, you look at the product, and then you find things are not there. So that's the difference between quality assurance. Quality assurance, as I said, proactive approach. It's a process. It's a process oriented. The quality control is about the product oriented. It's a reactive approach. Then there are a few topics you're going to see in this chapter. For example, you're going to see data management. And data management is about, for example, all the policies, practices, procedures you need to have throughout the data lifecycle. What I mean by data lifecycle, from the creation of data um, until the when you want to dispose of this data or you want to retire this data. That's the data life cycle. So how do you handle it? How do you make policies of it? How do you deal with it? All these things come under the data management umbrella. Then comes the data policy. For example, every organization, corporate level, they decide how they're going to deal, what is their data policy. For example, that comes under the, let's say there is there are classified information, there's a proprietary information. How are you going to retain this? How are you going to deal with this? So this is a detailed policy that comes from the top management, and that comes under the data policy. Metadata is about data which is related to another data. So it's kind of a, you see in one data and they give you reference to another data, and that may give you reference to even another data. So in that case, you can say that this is a metadata, which is basically data referring to another data. Then comes the data security. Data security is about restricting unauthorized access, we talked about, and making sure that your data's integrity is maintained, it's not changed, it's not modified. And then we'll talk about this, some of the policies. Data remnants, what you do with the leftover data. For example, you may have formatted your hard drives, you may have removed, but there may be some part of the data. And remind you, your trash may be someone else's treasure. The piece of chit, you just throw it, maybe a password written on it, maybe a username written on it, that may not be very important to you, but that may be a treasure for someone else. So you should have a proper policy for disposing of these information. So in some cases, the data is still the leftover. So you need to have certain mechanisms to to erase that data completely. Media destruction is, a lot of people just, in companies, they have a how do you dispose of these hard drives? Can you just throw it into the trash bin? Can you just throw it into the dustbin? No, you need to have a proper procedure for destroying the media or the USB hard drive, whatever you're using. So there are normally, you see two types of hard drives: the solid state devices and the hard disk devices. It's easier to deal with the solid state devices because they have a built-in tools, and they can help you to irreversibly remove everything from there. But in case of HDD, generally they do it is to overwrite it, but it's kind of a more challenging in HDD than the SSD, the solid state devices. But anyway, the organization should have the proper media destruction policy, just to make sure that no other competitor, no other outsider can have access to this. And as I said, that can be a big asset or the treasure for that person. So you don't want this to happen. Then comes the IT asset management. It's kind of inventory. For example, in case of disaster, you're looking for replacement of your servers, you're looking for accessories, you're looking for production software, you're looking for a lot of hardware resources. Maybe it's very important to have and maintain an inventory list or the IT asset, so that you should have a proper mechanism, so that you should know what things. And in some cases, let's say your supplier is not available, the third party supplier whom you depend on for your production, because let's say supplier is not available. So in that case, you need to know, or you should have access to all the inventory you have. So that comes under this. Then data retention policies. For example, as I said, PII, personally identifiable information, by law, it's the responsibility of the employer to protect the personal private information of employees. No matter which state you are in, PII is legally bound on all the employers. Similarly, there is another HIPAA, Health Insurance and Portability and Accountability Act. HIPAA is for in the healthcare for professionals. So whether you are a doctor, you are associated with paramedical staff, nurse, insurance agent, whoever you are, you need to protect the information of the patients, of all the patients. You're not supposed to disclose it. So this is also the law. And these organizations, the hospitals, the insurance companies related to this healthcare, the paramedical staff, they need to make sure that they have proper data retention mechanisms, so that they can protect this data. Similarly, there's also a requirement in terms of payment card industry. For example, if you are a merchant, if you are a store owner, if you are a businessman, and you offer people to use credit cards or debit cards, it's your responsibility that this information about their credit cards, their debit cards, their transactions, that should remain confidential. You're not supposed to share it with anyone else. That's also the law. So if you are a merchant and you accept these cards, it's your responsibility to make sure that they should not go into the wrong hands because you have access to that information. So, these are the examples of data retention policies. Then comes the encryption tools. There are two ways you can do this. One is the link-to-link link encryption, and the other one is the end-to-end encryption. Link encryption, as the name says, is only limited to a certain link. For example, in networking, we use the term hop. Hop is between two routers. So let's say if you have encrypted a link between two routers, you can call it as a link encryption because that's only effective within that link. But end-to-end encryption means, a sender and the receiver. And so it's encrypted all the way from sender to the receiver. Only receiver can decrypt and sender can encrypt, or in vice versa. So what I'm trying to say here is that's the end-to-end encryption. How do you implement an end-to-end encryption? There are different ways. Nowadays, every USB hard drive you buy from the market that comes with a built-in encryption software. You can also buy a separate encryption software, or you can also use the file-based encryption mechanism. So there are different ways you can use it. And link encryption is, of course, has to do with the networking, and we will probably talk about it as we go on. Then there are some protocols they say you should use instead of this. For example, if you're looking for a website access, instead of HTTP, you should use HTTPS. And remind you, S in the end means secure. So, excuse me. HTTP is without SSL, without TLS. HTTPS is with SSL. So if you're using secure socket layer, or it's a new version which is called TLS, which is transport layer security, you are secured in a network like internet, which is the most insecure network, as I said. So make sure whenever you use these protocols, mostly you use these secure protocols. For example, HTTPS instead of HTTP, FTPS instead of FTP. Similarly, SCP or SFTP, they are also secure. And don't use Telnet. We have used Telnet a lot. We know Telnet is for the remote connectivity. You want to remotely connect to a server. This is what we used to do when we were back in school, and we used to access university, the softwares. So we used to telnet to the university servers. But at that time, we did not have much network security related issues. But telnet uses the plain text credentials to connect, and that's not good. Because it uses plain text credentials, anyone can sniff in, can use a sniffer, can use a protocol analyzer, and can figure out your password, your usernames, and these things. So it's not secure. So you need to use SSH. SSH is secure shell. It uses port number 22, and it uses a encrypted not only the payload but also the credentials. So SSH should be used instead of Telnet. Similarly, for remote desktop, we advise RDP, RAdmin, because they are more secure than the VNC we had. There's another concept which is mentioned in this chapter, which is scoping versus tailoring. What is the difference between scoping and the tailoring? These are the concepts you're not going to see in other security certifications. These are the things you only see in this CISSP. Scoping is about, let's say, you want to have, let's say, bring a database into your environment. Then you decide what is the scope of your job. You may not need some particular functions, or you may not need some particular implementations into it. So you decide about the scoping. Tailoring means you want to customize it. So let's say the instead of having names, usernames, you want to change it to some, let's say, number-based scheme. So when you customize a solution or bring it into your environment and have a customize, you call it tailoring. So that's the difference between scoping and tailoring. The scoping is when you want to have a, let's say, limit a scope, for example. You don't want these things to be implemented because you don't have these things in your environment. So you only want to be a limited scope. And tailoring means, as I said, that you want to customize it according to your specific requirements. So that's the difference between these two.